Well, what started out as a student demonstration in the Bangladeshi capital of Dhaka has grown into a massive protest over unsafe roads. Hours after two students were killed by a speeding bus, protesters began to fill the streets. They stopped drivers, they checked licenses. Here's some background for you. Approximately 18,500 people die in Bangladesh every year from road accidents. For more, we're joined by freelance journalist Samira Sadek, who was born and raised in Dhaka. Good to hear from you this morning.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for having me.
Explain to us how these student protests started out as demonstrations and then became this massive citywide protest that has now drawn international attention.
So right after the deaths of the two students 2 weeks ago, it was school children who actually took to the streets, which is unprecedented. Even though student movements in general are pretty common, or student protests and demonstrations are pretty common all across Bangladesh, it was the school students in uniform who took to the streets that caught the national attention and eventually grew into an entire movement that still in a lot of ways persists. Even though the protests have died down, a lot of people back home are posting on social media about how they're following traffic regulations now, which, you know, believe it or not, was not at all a thing before these demonstrations began. People are carrying their licenses. Those who have been driving without their licenses are beginning to get theirs. People are putting on seat belts, which was not at all maintained before this.
Samira, you're in the U.S. now, but as we mentioned, you were raised in Dhaka. So I want you to give us a sense of what the roads are like now, why the protests needed to happen in the first place, and just to give some background to our viewers, you know, Dhaka is the most populated, most crowded city in the world. Mumbai comes in second. So what are the roads? Yeah, what are the roads like? What are regular everyday driving conditions like for people?
They're narrow. They're constantly under construction. Dhaka, especially in a place like Dhaka, where monsoon season there is heavy rainflow, the streets often get flooded very easily. There in terms of the vehicles, there are the buses, there are the cars, and there are the rickshaw cycles, which all have very different pace in terms of their movement. Yet there are no lanes for each one of them, and that's essentially what the students did this time. Is that they separated them by lanes, and there were no overtakings under the students' regulations. But on a regular basis, there are vehicles often overtake each other. People don't necessarily follow traffic lights a lot, or neither do they follow directions from traffic police. There are many who drive without license, as I mentioned earlier, and speed is definitely an issue, especially because no one's ever held accountable for it. No one ever gets a ticket for it. Even the cops on the streets will often let you go just with a small bribe.
So there is some change that's come as a response to these protests. The mayor has announced a new plan. They're going to operate 4,000 buses in the city. That will happen under 6 companies. Explain to us here in Canada, how will that improve anything?
The idea is to reduce sort of the number of ownerships over the buses in order to reduce competition, because as recent reports show, it's essentially the competition that's causing these buses to drive at such high speed just so that they can pick up more passengers. The drivers, most of them don't have a monthly salary. They are commissioned as per the number of passengers they pick up. So the idea for this new rule is to sort of reduce that particular incentive by bringing it under a fewer number of ownerships. At the end of the day, it's still on the hands of those who are on the streets and those who are driving, because as we've seen in the last 2 weeks, just with a little bit of self-governance and self-regulation, it's the people of the city that have been able to sort of bring a lot of change. Even when the students were on the streets and they were checking licenses, it did bring the city to a standstill, but most people appreciated it just because road safety is an issue that affects everyone across the different classes in Dhaka.
Samira, thanks for talking to us this morning.
Thank you for having me.